Welcome, good morning. Welcome to our 2021 Legislative Update and Vaccine Briefing event this morning. My name is Agnieszka Carpenter and I'm the Executive Director for BioME. BioME is the Bioscience Association of Maine, and we are the trade industry group for life sciences. And our mission is to advance bioscience in the state of Maine and also to create opportunities for our community. It's very nice to see everybody today. So warm welcome to our community, but also to all the honorable state legislators who are joining us today. We'll hear from some of them at the beginning. And normally we do this event in Augusta, at Senator Inn, or in Hallowell, but this year obviously is different. So we decided to switch things around a little bit and do a Zoom event that's themed. And obviously the theme today is something that's on everybody's minds right now, which is the COVID-19 vaccine. We actually haven't done a COVID themed event since May, so it'll be good to catch up and just see what the community has been up to and how far we've come, because we've come a really, really long way since last March. I hope you will learn something new today and enjoy the program. We're scheduled to go up to noon, but we may actually end a little early. We'll see how it goes. I will show you the agenda. So we're going to start with some remarks from me about BioME and what we've done, what we did in 2020 and some plans for 2021. Then we're going to have our legislative update part, and we'll hear from Representative Seth Berry and Senator Sanborn. Then at around 10:30, we'll move to our vaccine presentations, and we have three very exciting speakers. We have Dr. Marnick from Husson University, who will talk about how the vaccine works and maybe talk about some myths and fears around the vaccine. Then we have Amy Walker from Bio. Bio is Biotechnology Innovation Organization, who we work with very closely. And then we have Dr. James Jarvis from Northern Light Health, who will focus more on the distribution of the vaccine in Maine. And then we'll have about 30 minutes for Q&A, although these times are pretty fluid, so we don't want to stress ourselves by the rigid timing. So just a couple logistics before we dive in. The chat function is on. If you would like to leave a question in the chat, feel free. If you prefer to save your question till the end and ask it in person, just raise your virtual hand or let me know that you would like to ask a question. If you just want to say hello or say who you are and where you're coming from, the chat is a perfect place to do that as well. We try to keep these events pretty interactive. This is why we're not setting them up as webinar, but meetings, because we like to see people's faces and we want to really make you feel like you're participating in an event and not just watching something on YouTube. Okay, so with that, I think I will move to what BioME has been doing. And 2020 was an interesting year for us, as for everybody. And you probably know that events are a big core of what we do. So we had to restructure the way that we do them. We managed to do one in-person event back in January. It was our open house in this beautiful space. But then we switched to virtual events, and you may be familiar with our coffee hour series. It's a monthly online series where we invite usually about 4 speakers to talk about the research that's being done in Maine and new companies, entrepreneurship, just anything that's new and exciting. And that's been working really well for us. So we did quite a few of those. We had Dr. Shaw at our November one. We had some really, really good researchers and interesting companies. And we also did some of our signature events, such as Women in Bioscience or our holiday mixer. We've been playing with the format and everything has really worked out well for us. So I'm glad to report that. And we will be continuing with the coffee hours. The plan for 2021 is to resume in-person events in the fall, obviously depending on how it goes and how well the vaccine works and how well we can roll it out in Maine. Another exciting update for 2020 was that we launched a campaign called Why Maine, with the purpose of informing the public of why Maine is a really fabulous place for life sciences, why it's becoming an emerging hub. We produced a video that you can see on our website, biomaine.org/whymaine. We also redesigned the bioscience map of Maine, which you may have seen in the past. This looks a little bit different now. It's animated, really exciting. And that website is also full of all kinds of resources for potential Mainers, for people who want to move to Maine or companies who want to move to Maine. Another big thing that we did in 2020 was a virtual Maine Bioscience Day. And I usually talk about Maine Bioscience Day at our legislative events. So typically we send scientists to middle schools to talk about science, to talk about careers, with the overarching goal of developing workforce in Maine. Obviously this year we couldn't do it, so we played with the idea of how to handle it, and we ended up producing a couple videos and sort of creating these packages for teachers where the teachers could play some videos. We had live Q&As with the scientists. We also designed a hands-on activity. So these boys that you can see here, they're actually tasting PTC paper outside. They're doing it safely to learn about genetic traits. And so we got an overwhelming positive feedback from the teachers. We were able to reach over 50 schools in Maine and about 5,000 students. So we'll definitely continue with this probably hybrid model of Maine Bioscience Day because it proved to be very successful. And then something new for 2021, I wanted to just touch upon it because it's brand new and we're very excited about it. So we just launched a scholarship program for life science majors, and we're pretty much giving away money to life science college students in Maine. And the application period just opened. It's $4,000. Academic scholarship, so just to help cover academic expenses. And we also have a summer internship award for students who get an internship that's unpaid or underpaid. And all you have to do is you have to be a Maine student, so either have a Maine ID or be enrolled in a Maine higher ed institution. It's also good for high school grads. So if you have children or if you know anybody who is a life science major and who could use some financial aid, please send them to us. The page is biome.org/scholarships. We're very excited to do this and create more opportunities. And the end goal is to convince students to stay in Maine and to make sure that they have the skill set that our companies need. And before we dive into the legislative update, I wanted to just give a shout out to the bioscience industry in Maine and its response to COVID-19. And so just have one slide here, but you probably are familiar with some companies such as Abbott or Puritan Medical Products or IDEX or Jax and a lot of others. We've always known that Maine has unprecedented, amazing expertise in human diagnostics. And when the pandemic started, it just became so apparent. And the speed at which these companies responded and what they did is absolutely amazing. So kudos to everybody who's on this call today, but also to the entire community here in Maine, because we feel that Maine really punched above its weight and it gained some global traction. And these news headlines have been all over national news. So we're just very proud and thank you so much. And I also do not want to forget to thank our sponsors. These are our annual sponsors. You can see their logos on the screen. Without you, it wouldn't be possible for us to have these events and to do the things we're doing. So thank you so much. Okay, and I'm going to stop my share. And I wanted to welcome Representative Seth Berry, who's with us today, and he will give us a quick update on what he's been up to, what the priorities have been, what it's like to be a legislator in the pandemic, and what his committee is doing.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Agnieszka, and it's great to see everyone. I am Seth Berry. I live in Bodenham. I've been in the state legislature for 14 years, and it's been a wonderful experience. As you know, Maine is a citizen legislature, so most of us are either retired or have a day job. I'm in the latter category, and I work for a bioscience business, a proud member of BioME, which is based in Richmond, and we call ourselves Kennebec River Biosciences. We work with fisheries managers and fish farmers on aquatic animal health. We also just work in the blue biotech space more generally. We produce vaccines for fish. Yes, fish do need vaccines. Do diagnostic testing. And a lot of the work that we've seen become so important in the human health sector during this pandemic. The legislature has really had to turn to the virtual model the same way that we're doing business today. The legislature is now operating in an almost fully virtual manner. We do need to periodically come together with the whole House, the whole Senate. We will mostly be doing that at the Civic Center. But the bulk of committee work, fortunately, is done in committees, joint committees with 3 senators and 10 members of the House. It's nice to see some of my colleagues here, and we're able to do that online. So we're very excited about this event, about the incredible momentum that bioscience has here in Maine, and we really want to hear from you in our proceedings across the committees in the legislature. My committee is the Joint Standing Committee on Energy, Utilities, and Technology. I'm the House Chair of that committee. So we work obviously on energy issues. Broadband is a big topic for us. There's a lot of work going on in that space, not all directly related to biotech, but certainly supporting it, because energy costs, reliability, connectivity, now that many of us are working from home, are more important than ever. So that's my committee, but there are other committees, the IDEA committee, which deals with innovation and economic development, the Education Committee, which deals with workforce, the Appropriations Committee, which decides how we're going to spend our state budget. All very, very important, obviously, and we encourage you to weigh in on those committees or any of them. It's easier than ever to do that in written testimony or over Zoom, and to participate in the citizen legislature that we're so fortunate to have. I want to say a word or two more about our amazing biotech sector here in Maine, because it's just biosciences in Maine is booming and has been so visible, so critically visible at a national and even global scale in addressing this pandemic. Agnieszka referred to that already. There's the usual suspects, IDEC and Abbott and Jax, Puritan, all of which she mentioned and we saw in her headlines. But then there's so many standout companies that are doing incredible things just below those headlines, below that surface. And they're smaller or mid-sized level companies, but they are contributing enormously. Maine has an incredible medical device manufacturing sector. Our own lab uses hoods from the Baker Company. These are biosafety cabinets to allow work to happen. Nice to see Baker represented here. David, good to see you. And they are incredibly important in this response to allow scientists to work safely with pathogens and other hazardous materials. Enercon Technologies is in Maine, and they make electronics instrumentation, very important to the work that we do and that other bioscience laboratories do. BBI Solutions, which produces reagents and does consultation for assay development. You got to have that, and I don't know if you remember, but there was a time when Dr. Shah was saying that the constraining issue for testing was reagents. They needed more reagents for testing to accelerate. So the supply chain, and we've heard President Biden talk about it recently. The supply chain is incredibly important, and Maine companies across the board are contributing to making sure that we do have a strong, robust, and diverse supply chain to allow bioscience to go forward. I think we all understand the importance of bioscience more than ever because of the pandemic. That includes legislators. At Kennebec River Biosciences, we like to say that pathogens evolve And so we need to be able to evolve faster. And that's our motto. It's what we try to bring to our work. And I think bioscience generally gives us that ability. It also gives us the ability to make life better and to really transform our health and our ability to thrive here on planet Earth. And he couldn't be with us here today, but I'd be remiss if I didn't mention to all of you that a new representative in my caucus, the House Democratic Caucus, from Portland, his name is Sam Zager. He is a doctor, a medical doctor, and I think he's seeing patients today, but he is bringing forward a bill to create a conversation in Maine about gene editing and the implications, good or bad, how Maine can sort of seize the opportunities inside of the revolution that is happening with CRISPR and gene editing technologies, and also just be ready for any adverse consequences that might have. Obviously, it's an incredibly powerful tool, and it has major implications that we should be thinking about. So I'm looking forward to that conversation led by Sam Zager. I want to just mention too that Maine is very committed to this sector. I know that's true for Governor Mills. I know that's true for legislators on both sides of the aisle and both the House and Senate. We are very aware that there are workforce concerns, that we need more skilled Mainers, whether they're Mainers who have come up through our own education system or have arrived here recently, right? We have new Mainers in our lab, and we have folks who grew up here. The workforce pipeline is so incredibly important, and that's why you see the Biosciences Association of Maine prioritizing that, creating our own scholarship fund. Thank you to all who've donated and made that possible, and to Agnieszka, so important. Maine also does allow what's called the Opportunity Tax Credit, and especially for those that have a higher education degree in STEM. This is really a powerful tool that you can use if you're running a business here in Maine and you're trying to attract talent. The Opportunity Maine Tax Credit, or Educational Opportunity Tax Credit, as it's more formally called, is fully refundable for those with a STEM degree, and it can be administered by the employer. So look it up. Educational Opportunity Tax Credit. That is something I think we don't talk about enough, and that we can use to attract talent here in Maine, and to retain talent here in Maine as well. The higher eds are doing an incredible job here in Maine. The Maine Community College system with some great biotech programs. The University of Maine system. We really want to continue to support those and do more there. Also encourage our middle schoolers and our high schoolers to start thinking about bioscience as a really promising future for them. And we also are very committed to supporting wonderful Maine institutions like the Maine International Trade Center, which Zeynep works for in her spare time, the Maine Technology Institute, which does an incredible job of supporting innovative businesses. Our company is an MTI portfolio company. The Finance Authority of Maine, that helps make flexible capital available. Maine has so many wonderful support systems for innovation and for new, innovative, smaller bioscience businesses that might someday become, the next IDEX or the next Jackson Labs. And so we really want to see that through. We see incredible potential here. I think we're all committed to that. If not every legislator is here with us today, it's not for lack of support. It's just that everyone has committee meetings and maybe a day job like myself. But we will take back whatever we come away with from the discussion today, and I'll stop there. But it's great to be with you all.
Thank you so much, Seth. I loved everything you said. Also, thank you for your service and work and everything you're doing for the state of Maine. There are over 420 bioscience companies in Maine. Not everybody realizes that. We do have the big players, but we have so many smaller companies that all do important work. A lot of them actually are doing COVID-related work, so it's just worth mentioning. So we were scheduled to have Senator Sanborn right now, but I don't think she's with us. So we will give her some time. Maybe she'll join us a little later. And I think we'll just move on to our vaccine presentations. And the first person who we have on our agenda is Dr. Elizabeth Marnick from Husson University. It was actually not that easy to find someone who would be willing to explain the science of the vaccine in Maine. So thank you so much, Liz. We really appreciate it. And I can't wait to see your presentation.
Well, thank you very much.
I think you're muted, Liz, for some reason.
There. Sorry. By now I should be good at Zoom, but you never know. So thank you very much for having me. I am really excited that I was able to be of help. For those of you who don't know my background, I did my PhD at the Jackson Laboratory, but it was a collaborative PhD program with Tufts University. And I did most of my research on immunology, which is why I have a vested interest in being able to make the science behind how vaccines work accessible. Science communication is also something I'm really passionate about, as well as education, which is why I'm now a professor. But I've been spending a lot of time trying to make the science behind vaccines and why they're important and why they're safe accessible to the general public. Because I think right now we're seeing there's this increasing misinformation around vaccines in general, but particularly around COVID-19 and these vaccines. So I've been doing a lot of work trying to help make this science accessible to hopefully alleviate people's concerns about these vaccines. So I do want to just give a quick disclaimer before I start that I have no financial ties to any of these vaccine companies. I'm only doing this as a public service to hopefully make people feel better about how these vaccines work and that they're safe. And also, obviously, everyone's medical situation is individual, so you should always talk to your personal physician before deciding one way or the other. So I want to first start by reminding people about how the immune system works. I know we have a mixed audience today, so I didn't want to assume people would remember this. So you can break down your immune system cells into two broad categories. One category is your innate immune system, and the other is your adaptive immune system. In your innate immune system, I like to use the analogy of your first responders. Your innate immune cells are the immune system cells that are first on the scene when a foreign invader, a bacteria or virus, enters your body. And these are the cells that try to eliminate that foreign invader if possible, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes they need to recruit more help. And when that happens, they have a system to activate the adaptive immune system. And I like to explain the adaptive immune system as being these specialized cells that can particularly target bacteria or viruses. Just like at a hospital, you would have doctors and nurses who are specially trained to deal with specific issues that you may be facing. So your immune system has all of these components that ultimately work to try to eliminate a pathogen when you've been infected. So let's say, for example, you come in contact with SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus that causes COVID-19. The first thing that will happen is your innate immune cells will recognize that that virus does not belong. They will then engulf it. They essentially eat these foreign particles, and then they will digest it and then show some of those proteins on its cell surface. And it does that as a way of alerting the rest of your immune system that, hey, I found this thing that doesn't belong, and we need to start attacking it. So the innate immune system will then activate your adaptive immune system, and it's those adaptive immune system cells that can be specialized. So when you hear people talking in the news about antibodies, those are part of your adaptive immune system that are able to be generated specifically to target whatever specific virus you've been infected with. The great thing about the immune system is that once that infection has been cleared, some of these antibodies and B cells and T cells, which are part of your adaptive immune system, some of them will actually form memory cells. And it's those memory cells that will just exist in your body to protect you if you're then re-exposed to that pathogen again later. Depending on the pathogen, that will either help protect you from getting sick at all, or it will help make it so that you're not as sick as you were the first time that you were exposed to the pathogen. The other thing I want to remind you guys of is what a very simplistic view of what your cell looks like. So inside of your cells, you have your nucleus, and inside of that nucleus is where your DNA is. And your DNA is the directions to make all of the proteins needed for an organism to function. And the DNA stays inside the nucleus because it can't get out of the nucleus, otherwise there's a risk of being damaged. So the DNA is always within your nucleus, but the proteins that actually do the job is made in the cytoplasm. So the directions to get from DNA to protein has to go through an intermediate, and that intermediate is mRNA. So when you hear people talking about these mRNA vaccines, one common concern that I hear is that the mRNA is going to damage your DNA. But that's actually not a concern because the mRNA that you get from the vaccine will stay in the cytoplasm, and it's not going to be able to go back into the nucleus to actually get to where your DNA is. All right, so now let's start talking specifically about SARS-CoV-2. So SARS-CoV-2 is a virus, and viruses cannot replicate without infecting a host. So that means that unless they infect some type of host, they can't reproduce at all. So they turn their host into a viral making factory. And the way that SARS-CoV-2 does this is it has this little image here, that's a spike protein on the surface of SARS-CoV-2. And that spike protein will attach to one of your cell receptors, which is called ACE2. And that allows the virus to then enter your cells. And once it's there, it hijacks your own cellular machinery to make copies of itself. And then that is what ends up making you sick. So this spike protein is of particular importance to the vaccine development because that's what the vaccines are targeting. But scientists were able to really quickly sequence the genome of SARS-CoV-2, and that's what's represented here at this top image. And the whole genome of SARS-CoV-2 contains the directions to make all of the components needed for the virus. But the vaccines that we're going to be talking about today, they're all targeting just this one region right here, which codes for the spike protein, because that is what your body is going to be producing its immune memory to, just that spike protein. So another common concern is people think that that the vaccines could potentially give them SARS-CoV-2, but that's actually not possible because the vaccines are just containing the information for the spike protein. The rest of the information needed to make the whole virus is not present. So there's no way that these vaccines could accidentally give you SARS-CoV-2 in the process. So for Moderna and Pfizer are the two mRNA vaccines that are currently approved for emergency use in the United States. And the way that these were made was they took the directions to make the spike protein. So again, just that small information from the whole virus. And they enclosed it in a lipid envelope. And they did that because RNA is very fragile. RNA normally gets degraded very quickly. Every time your body needs to make more proteins, it makes a whole new RNA molecule. They don't stick around for very long. So without this lipid envelope, the RNA would be degraded and chopped up before it could actually do anything to elicit an immune response in somebody. So this lipid envelope is there to protect the RNA so that it can actually get inside of your cells. And then once that happens, so once you actually receive a vaccine, if you receive one of the mRNA vaccines, what will happen is that your innate immune system cells near the injection site will see this foreign particle and they'll recognize that it doesn't belong. So just like in a normal immune system process, those innate immune cells will engulf the the vaccine particle. And then what will happen is that the RNA, the lipid envelope will be broken up and the mRNA will get into the cytoplasm of your innate immune system cell. And once that mRNA molecule is there, your cell knows what to do with it because it knows what to do with RNA. Whenever it sees an RNA in a cytoplasm, it knows to turn that into a protein. So in this case, the vaccine is tricking your immune system cell into making this spike protein. And then what will happen is that your innate immune system cells will present parts of that spike protein on its surface, and that will elicit your adaptive immune response that will ultimately lead to the generation of memory cells. So these vaccines are important because they allow you to produce those memory cells to protect you without you actually having to risk getting the real virus and risk the long-term consequences or death that can result from getting the actual infection. The other two vaccines that I want to just briefly talk about here are the Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca vaccines. Right now, the FDA is meeting to talk about giving the Johnson & Johnson vaccine emergency use authorization. And this vaccine is similar in design to AstraZeneca, which is why I'm lumping them together, because the mechanism of how they work is very similar for both of them. So what these companies did is that they took the directions to make the spike protein, and SARS-CoV-2 is an RNA virus, so the directions is normally in RNA form. And they converted those directions to DNA and then inserted those directions to make just the spike protein into an adenoviral vector. So adenoviruses are a common virus humans become exposed to just over the course of their life. And it usually typically causes, if anything, going to cause mild cold symptoms, a runny nose, maybe a cough, sneezing, that sort of thing. But the viral vectors that these companies are using have been modified so they can't replicate inside of your cells, and they're also not going to risk getting you sick. So the vaccines for Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca contain this adenovirus that has been modified so it can't replicate, and so that it has the directions to make that spike protein. So then what will happen if you get this vaccine is that the adenovirus knows how to attach to cells. So that is why we're using it as a vector, because once you get this vaccine, it will attach to some of your cells and enter those cells. And then it will put that spike protein, the directions to make that spike protein, into your nucleus, where you can then make spike protein RNA, and then you'll make spike protein. And just like in the last example I gave you, your cells will start to present some of those spike proteins on their cell surface, and then that will alert your immune system that there's something there that doesn't belong, and then your immune system will form those memories to that, just like in the other example that I gave you for other vaccines. So this is another way that your body can produce those memory cells without you having to risk going through the actual infection. And then I also just wanted to talk about the Novavax vaccine, because this is, and they're getting close to being done with their trials, and I expect they're going to go up to try to get approval soon as well. And this system is very unique, so I wanted to mention it as well. But they used, what they did is they took, again, the DNA directions to make the spike protein. But this time what they did is they inserted it into a virus that infects moth cells. And they did this in a dish. And then what happens is they expose this virus to moth cells. And then they cause these moth cells to turn into spike protein making factories. So these moth cells produce these spike proteins, and then the scientists harvest these spike proteins and then assemble them into nanoparticles that have these spike proteins on their surface. And then what they do is they combine those spike protein nanoparticles with proteins from a soapbox tree, and that's what we call an adjuvant. So sometimes the spike protein alone would not necessarily be enough to activate your immune system as strongly. So they also combine it with this other protein to make sure your immune system understands that this doesn't belong and can mount an effective immune response. So the Novavax vaccine, if eventually approved for emergency use, is a protein vaccine. So your body doesn't have to make any of the spike protein itself. Instead, you get this vaccine, your body sees these spike proteins in this nanoparticle, recognizes that it doesn't belong, and still generates that immune response that will ultimately protect you if you're exposed to the real virus. So that was a lot of vaccines. So here's a table that's comparing them, because I know some people may have questions as well about the efficacy of these vaccines against some of the new variants that people are talking about in the news. So overall, I want to first talk about Moderna and Pfizer, because those are the two mRNA vaccines that are being used right now. So for the original variants, these vaccines were about 95 to 94% effective at preventing symptomatic disease. And that's really, really good. I saw the graphs when they released their data, and I like squealed and went to my husband and shouted with excitement, because the graphs were beautiful. I was very excited. But because Pfizer and Moderna did their clinical trials before some of these new variants were widespread, we don't actually have human data yet to know what the effectiveness may be now with these new variants circulating. We do have some data done from in vitro studies, so data done from the dish, where they just isolated antibodies from patients who had been vaccinated and looked to see how well those antibodies worked. And they did see a drop in the ability of those antibodies to work against these new variants, but they think that they're likely to be still effective. My issue with those studies is that your immune system isn't just your antibodies. Your immune system also produces your memory T cells and your memory B cells. So I haven't put any data there because we really need to wait until we see data from humans to know what the actual drop in efficacy may be. The also really important thing is that these vaccines were 100% effective at preventing the need for hospitalization and death if somebody did get COVID-19 after getting the vaccine. So then for AstraZeneca is a little hard to explain because they had some different dosing mechanisms. But overall, it looks like their vaccine is about 62% effective. And they didn't see any change with the variant that we call B1117. And that's the variant that was first identified in the UK. So the media calls it the UK variant. But they did see a pretty big drop in efficacy against the South African variant. So you may have seen in the news that that means South Africa has decided to pause using that vaccine there for now. The data they have with that, though, was very small. So we really don't know if it still prevents hospitalization or death, because if it does, that's still a great vaccine to use. They just currently don't have that data yet, but hopefully that will be coming soon. And then for Johnson & Johnson, so I did update these numbers yesterday because the documents from the FDA were made public. So the Johnson & Johnson did their trials while these variants were already circulating in areas. So what they saw was that 72% efficacy against the normal original variants. And they didn't see a change with this UK variant. And then they did see a drop to about 61 to 64% effectiveness against the other variant, which originally was identified in South Africa. They also saw that it was 81% effective at preventing hospitalization after 14 days, and that rose to 100% after 28 days. So that is still great. So even if somebody who gets this vaccine does eventually get COVID-19 after being exposed, they're still protected from this worse outcomes, which is really important. And then Novavax also is doing their clinical trials now when these variants are widespread. So they released some preliminary data, but this is likely not going to be the final numbers because the trials are still ongoing. But they saw 95% effectiveness against the original variants. That dropped to 85% for the UK variant, and then 60% for the South African variant. But again, even in their trials, even with these variants, they saw 100% efficacy against hospitalization and death. So I think overall, a lot of people in the media variants are not unusual. Viruses mutate. We know that is what happens. The more we allow this virus to spread, the more variants we're going to get, which is why it's important to stop the spread of this virus. But so far, I don't think we see anything that's super concerning in terms of these vaccines they're still going to offer protection. And also the companies are working to make modifications in case that is eventually needed. All right, so I just have a few things I want to mention in terms of some common myths. So some people think that the side effects you get after getting a vaccine means that the vaccine is making you sick. And I would just want to clarify that that's not the case. When you're sick, your immune system is working, and that can be one of the reasons why you get these side effects. And then when you get a vaccine, you're not getting infected with the virus, but your immune system is still working. So those side effects that you get sometimes after getting a vaccine are just signs that your immune system is actually doing something. But if you don't get any side effects, don't panic, because in trials, they saw that it didn't matter. Everyone produced an immune memory response, regardless of whether or not their side effects arose. Everyone has a slightly different genetic profile for their immune system, so everyone's going to respond a little bit differently. I know some other people also have concerns that they made the vaccine really fast, so they skipped important safety steps. And I think that has led to some distrust, especially among the general population. So I just want to reassure everybody that they didn't skip any safety steps. So one of the reasons why they were able to make these vaccines so fast is because this virus is very similar to other viruses that we've seen before. So we know that SARS was a problem in the early 2000s, and researchers spent time trying to perfect and make a SARS vaccine. Unfortunately, after the virus stopped becoming a problem, funding dried up to really make that a possibility. But people were still working on vaccines for SARS. So once researchers knew that COVID-19 was going to be the problem that it is, they quickly pivoted the research that they had done with the SARS vaccines and were able to modify them for COVID-19 vaccines. Also, typically the way that it's done is phases of trials are done one after the other because it's not a pandemic. But due to the need to have these vaccines made, they received approval to do all of the same phases needed, but they just did them overlapping. So that allowed them to collect all the same safety data. They just did it faster because they were able to overlap the phases. The other important thing is that usually the longest part of a clinical trial is phase 3, and that's because you give some people the vaccine, you give some people the placebo, and then you have to wait until enough people have gotten the virus that you're trying to see if the vaccine works against. And then you have to look and see, well, did people in the vaccine group get it less than people in the placebo group? Normally for viruses that we're making vaccines for, we have to wait a while for there to be enough cases in the trial participants because the viruses aren't circulating as much in the community. But because the pandemic has spread worldwide and there's millions of cases worldwide, they were able to get that phase 3 data really quickly because the virus is everywhere and they hit that number needed in the trials to see if it was actually effective at preventing symptomatic disease. So they didn't skip any safety any safety steps. We do have the data to show that these vaccines are safe. And the last thing that I want to talk about is the most common question that I get from people is that they're worried that these vaccines, specifically the mRNA ones, are going to cause infertility. And this arose, I don't even know for sure where the origination of this myth is from, but it's been circulating that, well, the reason people think that this is a concern is that there is some amino acids, and amino acids are what build proteins. So you can think of them as like the Lego building blocks that make proteins. All of these amino acids come together to ultimately make proteins, but there's only 20 amino acids in total. So that means all proteins have some amino acids that overlap. And this myth originated because people were saying that the spike protein shares amino acids with a protein called secession-1, which is important. It's an important protein in the human placenta. So people were saying that because you're producing antibodies against the spike protein, you're going to be producing antibodies against the placenta, and that's going to cause infertility. And that's not true. I myself went and did protein alignments to see how similar these two proteins are. And yes, they share some amino acids because all proteins do, but there's not a concerning level of similarity between these proteins that would make that an actual risk. Your immune system is sophisticated. It can tell the difference between proteins, otherwise it would have other issues. So there's no reason to think that the antibodies produced against the spike protein would also work against the placenta. And if this was an issue, we would also expect to see it in natural infections, because in natural infections, your body also produces antibodies against the spike protein. And we have no evidence from trials. People got pregnant fine. And in the real life population, we haven't seen an increase in that. And this slide is just showing you that we have, in all of our proteins, we do have regions of amino acids that are similar, but the rest of the protein is different. And the overall shape that those proteins take are different. And our immune system can tell those apart. All right, so the bottom line is that all of these vaccines work because they generate an immune response to the spike protein that then results in those memory cells forming that will protect you if you're then exposed to the real SARS-CoV-2. All of these vaccines show effectiveness at decreasing disease severity and death, and all have been shown to be safe. So the best vaccine, because some people ask me what I think the best vaccine is, and I think they're all going to be great and they're going to help end this pandemic. So the best vaccine is going to be the one that you're able to get first. So with that, I'll end. I know that this was very quick and that a lot of people may have other questions. So I did leave my contact information here as well. And people can contact me after this if they have other questions that we don't get to in the question and answer session.
Okay, thank you so much. And I love that you included your Instagram handle. I'm going to go and follow you today. So I don't know, Liz, if you saw that, but you're getting a lot of praise in the comments because this was truly amazing. And I think anybody could understand it very clearly. If anybody has questions for Dr. Marnick, please leave them in the chat. I myself have a lot of questions. And also just one comment, it's crazy how something new can cause so many myths. So infertility is one of them, you know, changing your DNA is another one. And that's just what it is. And you also mentioned that if you have no side effects after the vaccine, it doesn't mean it's working. That's another myth I've heard. My husband actually got the vaccine and he had 0 side effects. So obviously a lot of people around us told us it's because he didn't really have the immune response. So it's good to hear from someone who's competent that, you know, all of these things are not really true. Although I guess time will show. So we are going to take a break from the vaccine topics just for a couple minutes because we do have Senator Sanborn with us. Thank you so much, Senator Sanborn, for joining us. So she will give us her update on what she's been up to and her committee work. And so glad you could join us.
I am so sorry for being late, folks. As Representative Berry could probably attest, our email inboxes are really especially difficult this year because that's the only way we're receiving information for everything. And so I apologize. I was behind in my email and missed this Zoom link. So I just have a couple of items to highlight for this group if we're sticking to sort of that biotechnology topic area. And the first one is LD1, which is our COVID-19 Patient Bill of Rights. And what it does is to ensure insurance coverage for testing and screening for COVID-19, unless it's part of a formal surveillance testing program, which are generally funded through some mechanism other than insurance. And so what we're hearing a lot about in this section of the LD1 has a bunch of sections, so I'll kind of walk through them, but what we're hearing a lot about is insurance carriers kind of making a judgment that the reason that you got a test wasn't medically necessary. And when we're talking about public health, when we're talking about COVID-19 being at the population transmission levels that it's at still today, those types of coverage denials are really not helpful to public health and obviously not helpful to Mainers who are trying to keep each other safe. So we're going to put in a mandate that insurers not second guess why someone went and got a test, but instead just simply cover it. We've even seen insurance coverage denials for pre-surgeries screenings, saying that that wasn't medically necessary or that it should have been billed differently or those types of things. And that's what we're trying to cut back on. Our very own Senate president had a bill in his hand when he introduced LD1 this past week from a pre-surgery screening. The next section of LD1 also ensures that the vaccine and its administration won't have out-of-pocket costs for any Mainers. And right now that's completely true because the only folks that are getting vaccine right now have to have an arrangement with the CDC that makes that true, right? The only vaccination clinics that can receive vaccine right now have agreed to not charge anyone an out-of-pocket cost for the administration of the vaccine. But at some point when the vaccine is much more widely available, there could start to be those changes, those charges. And so we're trying to guard against those in advance and ensure that insurance companies are going to pick up the tab instead. Another section of LD1 gives permission for physicians who are running vaccination or pharmacists who are running vaccination clinics to be able to delegate their vaccination authority to other folks who are working at the vaccine clinic who have received the appropriate training. And so what that's going to allow us to do is have other medical professionals, including potentially veterinarians, dentists, those types of folks, being able to provide vaccines and potentially volunteers as well, retired nurses. There's all sorts of folks that we're going to be able to utilize in the volunteer and workforce to make sure that we can get every Mainer vaccinated as soon as there's vaccine supply available. And so it was important for us to put this in a bill to ensure that licensing of those individuals doesn't get in the way of our ability to quickly vaccinate in huge quantities of people that we're going to see. I think we will have never lived through, or at least folks my age have never lived through a period of time where we will have had to administer so many shots in such a short amount of time as we ramp up into the spring and early summer going forward. So we're trying to anticipate, working with the Department of Health and Human Services, what those needs are going to be going forward. And then the other piece of LD1, and that's actually going to be the subject of probably about a dozen bills in our committee this session, is telemedicine. And so we will be looking at what the best pieces of what we've learned about telemedicine, about its value during this pandemic have been, and then trying to make sure that we enshrine those not just in the executive orders that have liberalized the ability for people to access telemedicine throughout the pandemic, but going forward as well. We need to figure out things like, are insurance companies allowed to reimburse at a lower rate for services provided via telemedicine? Right now, they're not, because of the pandemic and because of some orders that the Insurance Bureau has put in place. But we're going to need to really noodle through all of the different implications of telemedicine going forward. And I expect it to be a really robust discussion. There's not a straightforward and clear answer yet. I don't think there's still a lot of mixed opinions on how much telemedicine and how free we should be with telemedicine once the immediate crisis and conditions that have forced us to use it over the last year have subsided. So that's going to be something that's going to occupy the spring for my the committee that I chair in the legislature. We have a whole bunch of other topics, obviously, but those are the ones that seemed sort of at the top of the list and perhaps of most interest to this group. But I'd love to answer any questions if people have any, or I can certainly talk about any other bills or topics that folks might be interested in.
Thank you so much, Senator Sanborn. I think we've learned a lot. And just a reminder to leave your questions in the chat. We will come back to all the questions during the Q&A at the end. And also there were a couple questions about the recording. We will have the recording of this event available on our website and also on our YouTube channel. And typically after the event, we email everybody and let you know when it's available. And please feel free to share the recording. Okay, so now we're going to move on to our next speaker, and it's Amy Walker from BIO. BIO is Biotechnology Innovation Organization, who we work with very closely. BIO is also one of our sponsor organizations, and we always welcome BIO at our legislative events. So Amy will be actually talking about the global vaccine development and where we are with that.
Thanks, Agnieszka. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the invitation to join today's call. I'm here today on behalf of BIO, which is a national trade association for biotechnology companies working in the fields of human health, food and agriculture, and industrial and environmental applications. And we're pleased to have great state partners like BioME. So our members are many of the companies that have initiated programs for vaccines and treatments to combat COVID-19 over the past year. Since January 2020, nearly 900 drug development programs have been initiated. 1/4 of the entire pipeline, or nearly 200 programs, are for vaccines, and 52 of those programs have moved into clinical trials. In just under a year from the declaration of the COVID-19 pandemic, more than 68 million vaccines have been administered in the US, and more than 21.5 million Americans are fully vaccinated. This week, HHS noted that the 7-day average for vaccine administration is 1.4 million doses per day. While there have been bumps along the road, this is indeed an achievement about 2 months into the vaccination campaign for a disease we were just hearing about this time last year. This slide shows the status of some of the vaccine development programs and also highlights the variety of technologies being utilized that Dr. Marnick just discussed. Not knowing what would ultimately be successful, it was important to have a lot of shots on goal. And luckily, many of these technologies do appear to be successful. So as we've already heard, in the US, Pfizer and Moderna's vaccines have received emergency use authorization. And over the past few weeks, we've heard positive data for Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca, and Novavax. AstraZeneca's vaccine is already being used outside of the US, and we anticipate that they will be filing for FDA review soon. And as we already heard, Novavax's trial is fully enrolled, and their data may also be a few weeks away. Outside the US, in addition to AstraZeneca's vaccines developed by Chinese and Russian companies have also been authorized for use by other national governments, but are unlikely to be used here in the US. I'll also note on the global front that doses procured through the COVAX vaccine pool have begun to be distributed. 600,000 doses were shipped this week to Ghana, and doses are also going to the Ivory Coast today. Slowing the spread of COVID everywhere is critical for stopping this virus. Of the vaccines in clinical development, only Merck's programs have been discontinued. These were ended due to disappointing interim data. Instead, Merck is pivoting to focus on their COVID therapeutic candidates, as well as providing vaccine manufacturing capacity to other manufacturers. And it's truly a scientific triumph that less than a year from discovery of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, we have authorized vaccines in use. In comparison, it took 20 months from when the original SARS virus was discovered in 2003 until a vaccine candidate was put into clinical trials. And we still don't have a proven vaccine against that virus. This slide provides additional detail about these late-stage COVID vaccines, including more information on the product characteristics and top-line trial demographics. Following Dr. Marnick's presentation, I'm not going to go into too much detail about all of the specifics since we've already heard about that. But again, Johnson & Johnson's vaccine is being reviewed by the FDA today at their Vaccines and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee. And on Sunday, the CDC's Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices will be meeting to vote on the recommended populations for use if everything goes well with the FDA today. I'll also note that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, unlike the other vaccines that are in development, is a one-shot regimen and has cold chain of 2 to 8 degrees Celsius. This may be easier to get to certain areas like rural populations, but will add more complexity as we will have 3 different vaccines with different cold chain requirements and different dosing regimens. HHS announced this week that if authorization for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is granted by the FDA this week, 3 to 4 million doses of their vaccine will go out next week, with 20 million doses being distributed by the end of March and 100 million doses expected by the end of June. And the administration is working with Johnson & Johnson to see if that timeline can be accelerated to get doses out even faster. I'll also note that this week, the FDA provided guidance for emergency use authorization for vaccines to prevent COVID-19. This reiterates their expectations for COVID-19 vaccine standards for granting an emergency use authorization. It reiterated the expectation that vaccine sponsors continue to collect data towards a full biologic license application after an EUA is granted. And it doesn't change the floor of 50% efficacy that FDA is looking for in order to pursue emergency use authorization. This new guidance did provide information on FDA's thinking with regard to trials for variant vaccines. Of note, the FDA will not be requiring large randomized controlled trials with a placebo for these variant vaccines. Instead, they're looking for immunogenicity studies where the immune response of a modified vaccine is compared to the immune response of the original prototype vaccine. And they're also looking for booster studies where a modified COVID-19 is administered to people who have already had the previous COVID-19 dose. And of course, with these variant vaccines, FDA will also be looking at the safety. With regard to ongoing research for variants, Moderna announced on Wednesday that they've shipped vaccine for their B1351 vaccine to the NIH for a phase 1 study. And Pfizer announced yesterday that they are starting a study looking at a third booster dose to see if that provides immune protection against these variants. There's also research ongoing for pediatric trials. The Pfizer vaccine is recommended for individuals age 16 years and up. Moderna's is 18 years and up. And so Pfizer has already fully enrolled a trial for 12 to 15-year-olds, and they're also going to be aging down their trial to age 5 years in the coming weeks. Pfizer is also initiating a trial with pregnant women to study the effects of the vaccine in that population a little bit more specifically as well. AstraZeneca is also enrolling for ages 6 to 17 years, and Moderna is looking at 12 to 17 years currently. So Dr. Marnick already discussed how we were able to go faster, but I want to briefly reiterate that speed did not come at the price of safety or efficacy. The clinical trial sizes for COVID vaccines were the same or even larger than trials for other vaccines, meaning that the data we have on the COVID vaccines is robust. So we've come up with an analogy of how we were able to go faster, thinking of the development process like building a house. So first, you need to start with a foundation. While we didn't have a vaccine for COVID when the SARS-CoV-2 virus emerged, the vaccine technologies or platforms that have been utilized have been tested and used in the development of other vaccines. Even mRNA, for which COVID is the first vaccine to be authorized using this technology has been used in other ongoing clinical trials and has been tested in thousands of people before COVID even came onto the scene. Second, new technology has enabled us to go faster, like building a house. Cranes are more efficient than simple pulleys. And so the scientific and technological advances that we've gained over the last couple decades have really accelerated the process. Advances in viral genome sequencing have made the underlying data on the virus available to companies more quickly. And technologies like mRNA do not rely on growing and then killing or attenuating a virus, which is subject to the timelines of natural biological processes. Third, buildings go up more quickly when there are more people pitching in, and similarly, strong collaboration between the US and international governments, companies, non-governmental organizations, and healthcare work together to form partnerships and find efficiencies. Having the building inspector on site or having the FDA providing rolling data reviews and feedback provided decisions in a more timely manner. And finally, prioritizing a project by putting additional money and staff towards its goals gets things done more quickly. Moving staff from other projects to COVID provided more brain power, and shifting funding overcame lags that companies often face in raising funds in order to start large trials. Companies also put their manufacturing staff to work earlier on in the process so that doses would be available immediately after FDA review. And so last year, we were hearing concerns that the public was seemingly not as enthusiastic about COVID-19 vaccines as might have been expected. This wasn't necessarily from outright opposition to the vaccine, and seemed to be stemming more from questions that were unanswered and people being in a wait and see mode. And it's admittedly a bit unfair to be asking people whether they would take a vaccine that didn't exist at the time and for which there was no data on safety and efficacy. But once Pfizer and Moderna's data was announced in December, we began to see an uptick in the number of people who report willingness to get a COVID-19 vaccine. And many polls over the past few weeks have seen this increase in vaccine acceptance across all demographic groups. And so now that people are lining up to get the vaccine, how does distribution actually work? Vaccine companies have been producing their COVID-19 vaccines at risk while clinical trials are ongoing. If a trial is not successful, their vaccines are not used, and it is a loss for the company. But that if they are successful, then we have doses ready to be shipped as soon as the FDA issues an approval and the CDC makes a recommendation for which populations the vaccine should be used in. Moderna's vaccine is being shipped to vaccination sites from a central distributor. At the distribution facility, vaccines are paired with a kit that includes syringes, needles, alcohol swabs, and vaccination cards. This is the system that we anticipate will be used for the vaccines expected to be authorized soon. However, due to their cold chain requirements, Pfizer is shipping their vaccine directly to vaccination sites. So the distributor or the company gets allocation information from the state to know which sites get how many doses. And as with all vaccines, there's always ongoing safety monitoring, which I'll discuss in more detail later. So while the goal is to immunize as many Americans as are willing over the next few months, manufacturing is still ramping up and supply is initially constrained. Pfizer and Moderna are on track to meet or exceed their contractual timelines, and additional vaccines are expected to be authorized soon, which will help increase available supply. CDC's Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, or ACIP, developed a framework for prioritizing who gets the early available vaccine based upon the projected timing of vaccine availability. This slide shows the ACIP's recommended priority groups. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with this basic concept, but as a reminder, Phase 1A includes frontline healthcare workers and long-term care staff and residents. Phase 1B includes certain essential workers and individuals over age 75. And Phase 1C extends vaccination to all essential workers, older adults over age 65, and adults between 18 and 64 with high-risk conditions. These phases are then followed by the general public. And in early January, HHS issued an announcement that older adults should be eligible for vaccination sooner, really bumping up that timeline for Phase 1C. And so while CDC has issued guidance, final decisions on who is prioritized is being determined by the states. Like many states, Maine is currently focused on a few priority groups: frontline healthcare, safety and critical COVID-19 infrastructure personnel, and people over age 70 years. And as of yesterday afternoon, Maine had reported administering over 300,000 vaccines, or about 16.5% of the state's population. And importantly, over 100,000 Mainers are fully vaccinated. So once the vaccines are administered, there's ongoing safety monitoring. While the authorized and late-stage vaccines are highly safe and effective, we will be learning more about the vaccines as they are used more broadly. And as with all vaccines, COVID-19 vaccines will be monitored for safety signals using existing systems like the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, as well as new systems established specifically for COVID. One new safety monitoring system is CDC's vSafe text-based monitoring. When vaccinated, individuals will receive information about how they can register for vSafe. Enrolling in vSafe will prompt periodic check-ins via text message asking about side effects. Reports that are made using vSafe that show more severe side effects will result in CDC follow-up and potentially reporting to the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. I also wanted to quickly note that due to the pandemic, we've seen drops in routine immunizations. CDC published data last year that showed declines in all vaccines except for the hepatitis B birth dose. And while pediatric rates have rebounded somewhat, a recent study from the consulting firm Avalier also found concerning drops that have not made up ground lost among adolescent and adult vaccination rates. We don't have definitive data about the reasons why fewer people were seeking routine vaccinations during the pandemics, but these drops were noticeable fairly immediately after the beginning of the pandemic. Pediatric rates have improved in recent months, potentially pointed the impact of lockdowns and factors like doctors not seeing well patients or well patients not wanting to go into a doctor's office for preventive care as reasons for these drops. For childhood vaccines, virtual school settings and more lax school requirements are also likely a factor. For adults, high flu uptake this past season points to not seeking care as a reason rather than general hesitancy about vaccines. Last year, AAP launched a campaign called Call Your Pediatrician, which encouraged parents to call their children's primary care providers to ask about the availability of appointments and the social distancing and safety precautions that the office had put in place. AAP is renewing this effort this spring, and other organizations are similarly concerned and working to raise awareness of this issue. And so as we consider a return to normal activities brought about by widespread use of COVID-19 vaccines, we need to work to recover these declines as well and encourage individuals to get vaccinated when they can safely do so that we're not facing outbreaks of other infectious diseases like measles or whooping cough on top of COVID. And so finally, to wrap up, I'd like to highlight some of BIO's resources on COVID issues. We developed a website called COVID Vaccine Facts that aims to provide scientifically based answers to many of the frequently asked questions about COVID vaccines. The pipeline data that I showed on my first slide is available at bio.org/COVID pipeline tracker, and that data is updated every Monday. And then finally, the last link contains information on BIO's COVID priorities, as well as resources for biotech companies and other employers. So again, thank you for the opportunity to share this information today, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you so much, Amy. This was super informative, and I really appreciate BIO's expertise. And for everybody, if you're looking for reliable information on the vaccine development and where we are, BIO works with these companies on an everyday basis. And so it's really the source of information, unlike some media and news. I actually didn't know about the decline in overall vaccinations. That's not a good thing, I guess, but hopefully it'll come back to normal soon. Okay, so our last speaker today is Dr. James Jarvis from Northern Light Health. He will be talking about how the vaccination rollout has been going in his area, and I look forward to his presentation.
Well, thank you for that. I'm going to make a note to self that I will never follow two very smart, intelligent women again in a presentation mode. So I don't have slides. There's a lot of reasons for that, not the least of which is my day job keeps me a little busy right now, but also because my information changes pretty much on an hourly, if not minute basis. In fact, while the other speakers were speaking today, I was in contact with Dr. Shaw and multiple other people around the state about our vaccination program. And I think that's one of the beauties about living here in Maine, and one of the things we'd be most proud of is that as a state, we speak with one voice, we work together collaboratively, and that is not what we see in other places around the country. And we've done that since the pandemic began almost a year ago for the state of Maine. So I'll highlight a couple of things. So I'll talk a little bit about why our vaccine strategy is the way it is in the state of Maine. So we've used an age-based approach to vaccination beyond that category 1A of healthcare workers, first responders, and a few essential workers. And there's a good reason why we've used an age-based strategy, and I believe we will continue to use an age-based strategy going forward. In the state of Maine in particular, but even if we look around the country, people who are over the age of 45 and as they get older, meaning that they reach the age of 65, 70 or beyond, are much more likely to have serious illness from being infected with COVID-19. That serious illness often results in hospitalization and unfortunately results in death. And so when we look at a population-based strategy, we want to target, especially when we have a limited supply of vaccine, that population that will best be served by being protected. And right now in the state of Maine, that is people over the age of 70. It also looks at our resources. And so I've been asked in many of these kind of situations, well, why aren't we vaccinating the more able-bodied so we can keep them as productive members of society? Now, I'm not going to debate whether people over the age of 70 are productive in our society or not. I personally think they are. But The reality is that people over the age of 70 get sick, need to be hospitalized. They're taking a hospital bed away from our critical resources that we already are strained in the state of Maine from a day-to-day historical standpoint. So we don't have enough hospital beds in the state of Maine to cover our normal needs, let alone during a pandemic. So if they were to take up that bed, and then an able-bodied person was in a car accident or had a heart attack or a stroke or some other illness that required them to be hospitalized, that bed might not be available to them because of individuals infected with COVID-19. So that's the population and the scientific standpoint for doing that. It also makes things a lot more logistically easier for us to administer the vaccine. What we've seen in states that have opened up their eligibility criteria to individuals who are younger than 70 or individuals with chronic illnesses, or in some cases, states say there is no eligibility requirement, everybody can come. What often that does is cause chaos instead of efficiency. While it sounds like a great idea because it means I can get the vaccine and I don't have to wait for the vaccine, but if all of us say I can get the vaccine, then there's not a vaccine for anybody. And that's the chaos that we've seen in a lot of other states. It also sets up undue barriers. If we put the criteria that you have to have a chronic condition or 2 chronic conditions or 3 chronic conditions, who decides which chronic conditions are the ones that are most important? Who decides whether you have 2 or 3 or more? And so that becomes a very difficult thing. We all have a birth date, and maybe some of us like to hide that birth date, but we do have a birth date. So logistically, that makes it easier for us to do that. And also what it does, if you open up beyond a particular strategy, it sets up more inequities to the vaccine distribution program. We know that if vaccine was available to everybody right now, we would find that those who have the most means, the most educated, and the most availability to technology resources like the internet and high advanced telephone services would be the ones who would be first in line. And yet, in all likelihood, they are the least likely to have severe disease from COVID-19. So that age-based strategy makes both scientific sense and ethical sense. And it's why I support the governor's decision to follow that. And I hope that we continue in a strategy. Eventually, all of us will be covered by an age-based strategy in a fairer, more equitable solution to vaccination than if we just opened it up to anybody. So with that, I'll talk about how our vaccination program has been going in the state of Maine. It had a few bumps in the road when we first started. It was difficult for us to get supplies of vaccine. Maine, because of its population density, was definitely on the lower end tier for the federal government's distribution. So that made it difficult for us. It's difficult in a state as large as ours with as much rural population as we have, particularly in use of the Pfizer vaccine, because it does have some logistical challenges to it. It needs to be stored in that ultra cold freezer. And so you have to have access to one of those. Northern Light Health purchased 4 additional ultra cold freezers to bulk up our capacity to be able to store the vaccine and use it. And in fact, right now for Northern Light Health, our preference is to use Pfizer vaccine, especially at our large scale clinics like at the Cross Insurance Center, where I happen to be right now in Bangor. Once we started to figure out the logistics of how we could handle healthcare workers and first responders and people in long-term care facilities, next logistics really was how do we reach out to our communities? And again, difficult in our state. There are many people who live in a rural community where at best they have a primary care office in their town. Because of the logistics of these 2 vaccines, it is not advisable for primary care offices alone to administer the vaccines. It often results in not only inefficiencies in delivering the vaccine, it results in waste. And that's one thing we just could not afford in our state, where our limited supply really hampered our efforts. So that's the reason why the Department of Health and Human Services, in conjunction with the governor's office, decided to first focus on large-scale vaccination clinics while still distributing vaccine to not only healthcare systems like Northern Light Health, but also to our federally qualified health centers and a few other smaller health systems and hospitals around the state. But the focus on large scale was because, again, it's that efficiency that's the issue. So EMMC, or Eastern Maine Medical Center, when it first started, was able to vaccinate approximately 500 people per day. When we moved our operations to the Cross Insurance Center, we can now safely and effectively vaccinate 3,000 people a day. That's a tremendous increase, and has allowed us to vaccinate a large percentage of our population over the age of 70. Again, coordinating that across the state. And so I saw somebody ask, that said in the chat room that they have an appointment at the Downs today. And I said, that's wonderful. And I'm glad to hear that. It asked if we reached that point now where maybe our supply actually is outpacing our demand for those over the age of 70. And I think we are hitting that in a few key areas, particularly in Aroostook County. Our friends in Aroostook County have done an amazing job at vaccinating their seniors. AR Gould has led the way, but certainly Cary Medical Center and Northern Maine Medical Center, as well as some retail pharmacies in the area, have just done a tremendous outreach job and have really saturated that market, which is a great thing to see. Down here in the central region, we have seen similar numbers to that, not quite as high as they've reached in the county, but getting close. And then in the southern part of the state, just because of population density, it lags a little bit behind. But I do think we are approaching that category, and I'm expecting that the governor's announcement this afternoon may address that as an issue for us and a way that we can go forward. Our process works very well. I'll kind of talk a little bit about some questions that I've heard and concerns people have had, particularly at our site here at the Cross Insurance Center, where we do have open appointments even for tomorrow's clinic, and why that is and what that means for our vaccine supply. We are very careful about that. The way the Pfizer vaccine is utilized is first it needs to be thawed. So as long as that vaccine stays within that ultra cold freezer, it has an incredibly long shelf life, far exceeding anything that we would expect to worry about due to the demand of vaccine right now. Once it's thawed, we actually have at least 5 days before we have to utilize it. So that's a good thing for us to remember, that it can stay in a regular refrigerator for 5 days after being thawed. The issue comes when it's reconstituted, meaning that when it's mixed with saline and we draw it up into a syringe, then we only have 5 to 6 hours to utilize the vaccine. And that's where that critical time frame comes in. And it's where we heard about wastage around the country, where it's been drawn up into a syringe, they don't have enough people to vaccinate, and then they have to throw that away at the end of the day because that time limit has expired. For Northern Light Health, we've developed a very precise process. We know almost exactly how many people are going to show up at our vaccine clinics each day. We've calculated out what our no-show rate is, and there always is a significant no-show rate, unfortunately, to those clinics, and thaw appropriately to the size of what the clinic is going to be. We draw up a certain amount before the clinic opens so that we have enough on hand to kind of get through. And then hour by hour, we actually readdress how much we draw up by how many people have come through the door, to the point where during our last hour, we almost always are drawing up as somebody walks through the door. So as you walk through the door, we draw up a syringe for you so that when you get through our entire cycle, you're getting that vaccine that was literally just drawn up moments before. With that said, that means that we have almost no supply at the end of the day. We have no extra, and therefore we have nothing to throw away or waste, even if we can't find anybody. I know that people continue to hear about, well, shouldn't there be a list? So at the end of the day, you can call all of these people. Well, if we do things in such a precision manner, we don't even need to call people because we can usually use up everything that we have with anybody who's in our building at that time. And so we don't have to worry about that wastage that we hear, unfortunately, repeatedly happening around the country. And our friends at the other health systems do something very similarly. It really is an ultimate precision method to how we allocate the vaccine. It's worked out very well for us. In the initial days of our vaccine clinics, we usually wound up with having maybe 20 syringes at most at the end of a clinic. We are so precise now that if we have 4 at the end of a clinic, it surprises me. And that's just been very, very good news for us. We are excited for at the time when we can advance beyond the age greater than 70 and feel that we have the capacity to do so. We also feel this will be a little bit easier population for us to manage. Many of our people over the age of 70 are hampered by mobility issues, which does slow us down in our process. And as we get down lower, we can be even more efficient, to the point here at the Cross Insurance Center, I expect that we will be able to vaccinate up to 5,000 people a day. When I say those numbers, please remember that eventually all of our clinics will be combined first and second doses. And so we never want to exceed that halfway point with first doses, so that 3 weeks from now, we cannot utilize everything that we do. So right now, when we're vaccinating somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 people a day, that's in anticipation to be able to then vaccinate 2,000 to 4,000 people a day in the future. And with that, I think I prefer answering questions, and so I'm happy to do that. I just see a couple there at the end of of the chat there. I'll answer the last one first about vaccine passports to travel to other countries. I do expect that will be a requirement. Some of us may remember the days, particularly if you were in the military or in the Peace Corps, that you had to show proof of vaccine to yellow fever before you could enter into a particular country. And in fact, for a period of time, you had to show that proof of vaccination to return to the United States if you travel to certain areas. So I do expect you will see some of that. Those of you who have been vaccinated were presented with a vaccine card. Again, if you've been in the military or the Peace Corps, you remember the days where we used to carry around a yellow vaccination card from the World Health Organization. I liken this to that same thing. You carry it with you wherever you go so that you have it on your person. I recommend that everybody take a picture of it with their cell phone so they have it on their cell phone. Some people have been laminating it. I ask that you don't laminate it until after your second dose because we can't put our stickers on it if you laminate it. But you should just be prepared to have that with you. I know certain airlines have been talking about having that. Some good news came out about a week ago that all of the major electronic health record systems, particularly Epic and Cerner as the two largest not only in the country, but in the world, are working collaboratively to make a virtual vaccine passport. So if that becomes the need to travel, that will be available. Again, those are in preliminary stages, but they do hope that by summer they will have created that. One of the great things I like about that is that they're actually talking to one another in the realm of electronic health records. Those two companies rarely collaborate on anything and usually build systems that don't want to talk to one another. So this is a wonderful improvement. And again, one of the things that I hope comes out as a positive after the pandemic, that we realize we are, a large community and a global community, and that we really need to work more collaboratively rather than competitively. So I'll turn it over to the moderator to see what other questions we have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jarvis. That was excellent. Okay, so the questions are coming in, and once again, if you have a question, please leave it in the chat or raise your hand. Some of the questions came in privately, so I will just read them. This is for, I think, Dr. Marnick. Please discuss the science of determining whether a vaccinated person is capable of infecting others. How is this measured, and what is the state of drawing some conclusions? I think that's something that everybody's wondering about. If you get a vaccine, can you still be infectious?
Yeah, so that is a great question. So the trials were done to look at symptomatic, and that was because at that point in time, it was the easiest way to do these trials. If somebody who was in the trial presented with symptoms, they would go get tested, and then we would be able to find out if that person had COVID or not. So just for logistics, a lot of the trials weren't swabbing everybody, because to figure out if the vaccine is actually protecting against asymptomatic infection, you need to be testing everybody in the trial regularly to see if those who don't show symptoms but do test positive for COVID-19. So the trials weren't done initially to show that. However, Moderna does have a very small subset of data that they did swab some of their participants, and they did see a drop in asymptomatic cases with vaccination. Johnson & Johnson's data that they released this week, and it's publicly available. I can drop the link in the chat if people would be interested. They also saw a drop in asymptomatic infection. So they did regularly test certain fractions of their trial participants, and they did see a drop in asymptomatic infection. We're also starting to get some data from Israel and the UK, where they're farther along in their vaccination process. And we're also starting to see encouraging results that suggest that there may also be a drop in asymptomatic infection. However, it's just a drop. I don't think any of these vaccines will 100% protect against asymptomatic infection. But we are starting to see encouraging data that it is going to reduce the likelihood of somebody being asymptomatic. The other thing that I think is important to talk about is a lot of people who then worry that, well, what's the point of getting a vaccine if I could have it and just not know? But we are still likely going to see a reduction in transmission. So there are other vaccines that don't prevent asymptomatic infection. But we still see, as a consequence of once those vaccines were rolled out, we saw a decrease in transmission. And that's because if somebody has no prior immunity, it's going to take a while for their immune system to build up enough to clear the infection. If somebody is immunized, they have that prior immunity already. So their immune system, even if they're briefly contagious, their immune system is going to kick that virus out much more quickly than someone who's unvaccinated. So that person would have less of a chance to actually spread the infection. So I think overall, once we get enough people vaccinated, it's going to actually truly help end the pandemic.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Marnick. I do have some questions from earlier today. I don't want to miss them. One is to our state legislators, and it is, how does the Maine legislation interact with the federal decision makers? I don't know.
Well,
Yep.
Senator Sanborn, do you want to start, and I'll chime in, or I can kick it off if you like.
Sure. So part of the legislation that I talked about had to do with authorization for vaccine administration, and there is a federal provision for that as well called the PrEP Act, which Congress passed, which has some provisions for allowing for non-traditional administration of vaccines, and our it likely preempts any state regulation that would contradict it. But we also wanted to just sort of take a bootstrap approach and just make sure that we were being very clear that we weren't trying to make any rules that were any different than the federal rules, but that we would extend those federal rules past potentially where the feds would keep them in place, which will only be as long as the emergency, the declared emergency lasts. So I don't know if that was really what the question was driving at, but that's the federal state coordination piece that comes to mind for me.
Yeah, I think
that's great. And I'll just add that certainly, you know, the early indications have been and the early actions have been that the Biden administration is very committed to working with governors and with state and local leaders. You know, I'm very encouraged by what I'm seeing so far. We also, as legislators, are, you know, able to reach out to our delegation, and you know, Senator Collins, Senator King, Representative Pingree, Representative Golden have all been fantastic about being responsive to my requests. So I think that's generally true for the 186 state legislators, but we try not to overwhelm them either, and to be conscious that they are only some of the representatives and senators down in Washington. But yeah, we try to work together.
I just wanted to chime in because I read the question in the chat, which was a little bit different. I know that, for example, Commissioner Lambrou and Dr. Shaw are talking to federal officials every day, like all the time, and probably Dr. Jarvis as well. So, you know, the legislators maybe aren't as involved in the day-to-day administration of that as our executive branch officials are in the Department of Health and Human Services and the CDC.
Okay, thank you so much. And actually, there's a question that I think is more directed towards the Maine CDC, but maybe Dr. Jarvis has any info on this, because that question keeps coming to us. And it's basically, how do small companies in Maine, biotech companies that are producing products for COVID patients, get vaccine priority for their manufacturing staff? So, you know, whether they're going to be included in the phase 1B or not. We did hear about a couple companies, like the ones that are on the news, like IDEX or Abbott or Jax, but there are a lot of other ones that are smaller, and they're still quite essential for COVID response. So is there any information on this?
Yeah, so I can state that it is from the governor's office as to which particular companies or individuals within those companies are on the essential workers list. So Jackson Labs is a good example. It is not everyone at Jackson Labs. It is only those that are working on particular COVID processes at Jax Lab. As far as how they get vaccinated, most of those companies have already been tied to a particular distribution site. So I'll talk about Puritan as an example. So Puritan, its two facilities happen to be right next door to two of Northern Light Health's vaccination clinic sites. And so we partnered with Puritan to make sure that we did vaccinate those particular individuals. I think something similar happened with IDEX down in the Augusta area. And so you know, it basically is that private-public partnership. This is a private-private-public partnership. And I think that's, again, a credit to the way we do things here in Maine. No competition there. We will do what we need to do. Similarly, the way we have been serving those that live in long-term care facilities and other congregate living situations. In fact, yesterday I got the Maine Vet Home reached out to me, and I believe we've been able to arrange for us to be able to assist them. And that's just been really, some of, again, I love living in Maine. It's a small town. We all know somebody or know somebody who knows somebody, and we can reach out that way. I think as far as expansion beyond those particular companies that the governor announced, that's obviously up to the governor's office.
And
Yeah.
could I chime on that as well? So in the phase 1B essential workers category in the ACIP CDC prioritization that I showed, they actually reference the Department of Homeland Security's, I think it's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency list of essential workers. And that does include biotechnology, research and development, and manufacturing staff. And so, while it was included in kind of the overarching recommendations and states are really making the decisions, we as Bio were kind of weighing in with the National Governors Association and encouraging states to make sure that that population was included as states were developing their prioritization as well.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. I was going to ask about this, and I do remember actually signing a letter and sending it to the governor's office. So we as an association are doing our best, but it's really up to the governor's office. So we can only pitch and plead and ask, but hopefully everybody will get their vaccines, especially the smaller companies that, cannot really afford the quarantining their staff if they're going to get the products out. Okay, I see another question here. Are there recommendations yet for individuals who have had COVID in regards to vaccines? So if you've already had COVID, should you be getting it? Why not?
So it is our recommendation that people who've been infected with COVID actually do go ahead and get the vaccine. Some will say that they should wait not wait past the 90-day period that we know that people develop a decent amount of immunity from their natural infection. But we do ask that, one, you don't be symptomatic when you come to our clinic, whether that be because of known COVID or suspected COVID, because we do exceed the capacity limits with a governor's executive order. And so, it would not be, we do not want to be a super spreader event at our vaccine clinics. So sometime between 14 days after either your onset of symptoms or your positive test and being symptom free, and 90 days, it is advisable to go ahead and get vaccinated if you fit into an eligibility criteria. And the reason there, and I know that I think it might have been Amy that had said it, this actually does reactivate your own natural immune system. I've been asked, why should you do that? Or if you've been infected, would that tamper down your immune system? The answer to that is no, and we have great evidence of that. If you think about the shingles vaccine is against the virus that infected you as a child with chicken pox that gets reactivated and causes shingles. So you've already had that virus. You've already built an immune system to that virus. It's just not as effective as we like. You get the shingles shot, and the shingles vaccine then reactivates your immune system so that if that virus was to become active again, you can fight it and therefore ward off shingles. So we already do that. So this is science, and science works. And so this is just a reinforcement of that same kind of thing. Similarly, we also know that coronaviruses do change over time, and that human beings' immunity to coronaviruses wanes rather quickly. And so this is more analogous to influenza, where we have to get an influenza vaccine every year because, one, our own natural immunity wanes to the influenza virus, and the influenza virus changes quite frequently, in fact, more frequently than coronavirus, thankfully.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for this. And speaking of changing and mutating, I have one question that came through email. So I guess this is to Dr. Martin. You talked about the two variants, the UK and the South African. Are there any other variants on the horizon that we should be aware of?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of news this week about variants detected in California and New York, but we really don't have enough data yet. So maybe, but I don't want to say anything until we have data. I think that the media is a little bit fear-mongering with some of this stuff. I think viruses mutate, and yes, eventually the virus may mutate in a way that is more concerning. And we are seeing that a little bit with the South African variant. But these new variants that are detected in California and New York, we don't really have data yet to know if they're truly more infectious or if they're truly more severe. So until we have that data, I don't really feel comfortable saying. I think we just they were recently identified, but we don't really know much about what they may be doing. But they are ones to consider watching.
Mhm. Great, thank you so much. We have a question from Representative Hymanson. If you are a healthcare professional, as I am, as a physician and state rep, you can, oh, it's not a question actually. You can register and be vetted to be a vaccinator through mainresponse.org. Thank you for that comment. I thought it was a question, my bad. That's great to know. Okay. Are there any other questions right now? I think I covered most of them.
Agnieszka, can we ask, is there a better idea of how many people are refusing vaccination?
Yeah, that's a great, go ahead.
No, Dr. Jarvis, go ahead.
Yeah, so that's a great question that we really don't have a great answer for right now. The best data we have is amongst healthcare workers, particularly those working in long-term care facilities. Initially, Maine was very similar to the rest of the country, where unfortunately only 30% of healthcare workers at long-term care facilities were accepting of the vaccine. But we've seen those numbers improve greatly in the state of Maine as we've done more outreach and education. Similarly to individuals who are residents of long-term care facilities, our uptake in the state of Maine has been exceeding what we see in the national average. As far as healthcare workers in general, and again, that's the next biggest group that we know data about, it appears that that is a similar response amongst healthcare workers in the state of Maine. Around the country, it was around about a 60% uptake, and we're probably in the 75% uptake. Still not where I would like to see us to be, but still better. And we're seeing a phenomena now of many individuals who are coming forward, now saying, listen, I saw my friends and my coworkers get the vaccine back in December and they didn't grow a second head. So I'm ready to have my shot too. I keep complaining that it hasn't made my hair less gray, but these don't affect our genes. They don't affect anything else. They're incredibly safe, and they're very effective. And so this is one of those things where America and the world should be celebrating technology, not fear mongering about it. These are tremendous advancements. People didn't fear when we invented the light bulb of bringing light into their house just because of the fear of electrocution. These are technologies that are life-saving and life-changing, and so we should be embracing them.
And Kaiser Family Foundation has a monthly survey that they've been doing over the last couple months that has some of the best data I've seen kind of tracking sentiment towards the vaccine. It doesn't necessarily look specifically at refusals among people who have had the opportunity to get vaccinated, but it does have data on kind of where the pockets of hesitancy are. And we've seen that shift over the last couple months. So, last summer and fall, I think there was a big concern about uptake in communities of color that had been, kind of disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 disease itself. And now where we're seeing some of the hesitancy is really among younger people, so like the 18 to 30 bracket, as well as people in rural areas. And so, I think that the messaging has been kind of shifting, and we've tried to, address people's specific concerns as we've heard different myths or different reasons for being hesitant. But I haven't seen any data specifically on the refusals, but there is a lot of really great data on intention.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned it was
Kaiser Family Foundation. I will drop the link in the chat.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And also, Amy, you did show some percentage. That's encouraging to see that refusal rate is going down. Okay, I also actually see one more question for Dr. Jarvis. Do you need volunteers at the vaccination sites? If so, what kind of qualifications do the volunteers need to be able to help?
So we do need a steady supply of volunteers, and we need both clinical and non-clinical, and we have to have certain criteria for each. For our clinical, right now we allow anybody who has a practicing license to be able to do vaccinations, and that's key. Working on ways that we can expand that out to include retirees, and then other individuals. And I know the governor's office is working with language with the legislature about how we can expand out beyond that. You know, I look at our veterinarian clinics, our clinicians. They are very skilled at giving shots. It's a lot harder to give a shot to a horse than it is to a human, and yet they're kind of on the sideline. We actually had a few that worked our line the other day, wanting to know when they can give vaccines. So that's all expanding. Maine Response is a good place for people to sign up, and then similarly, if they go to northernlighthealth.org, they can help as we open up our second large-scale clinic in Portland. That'll become necessary for us down in that area as well. We do a quick background check, but if it's a company or a corporation that already has done those for their employees, we just ask them to sign an attestation that they have done those background checks. You know, we want people to be safe while they're getting their vaccine, and so safety first, and then we will deal with everything else afterwards. But pretty much anybody can do it, and I will tell you, it is one of the most rewarding things that I have ever done in my career. Everybody is just so thankful to be there, and it's a joyous day, and it's heartwarming and heartbreaking at the same time when we hear people tell us, I have not been out of my house since March, so thank you for being here and letting me come. It's been wonderful to see some of our individuals dressed to the nines as they come through their vaccine, because today is the only day that they get to be out and about, and so that's been great. And it's also for the promise that someday soon they'll be able to do that more often.
Mm-hmm. No, that's really great.
Can I just chime in? I have actually had the privilege of being able to volunteer at the Cross Center, which is a clinic that Dr. Jarvis runs. And I've been able to do it weekly. And I have to say, it's like my favorite thing of the week. I love teaching too, but it's just so great to see truly how happy they are. And I like almost cried my first day seeing these elderly people. One guy told me like he hasn't been able to hug his grandkids, and he like finally thought he could eventually, like he could see in the future he'd be able to hug his grandkids again. So, and I do it as a non-clinical volunteer, so I help with the other things because I'm just a scientist, not a medical provider.
But please don't say just.
That's true. That's true.
Please don't say that.
But it's really amazing, and it's definitely one of the highlights of my week.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's so great to hear. Dr. Jarvis, any timeline on the Portland clinic and when that would be opening?
We're expecting that will open on the 2nd. So just finalizing things. In fact, I'll be down in Portland tomorrow to kind of go over last minute logistics. But everything seems to be ready to go. They have staff, and they'll just be moving their vaccine clinic from Mercy Hospital over to that location. So that'll be great. And we're hopeful that the governor's news conference today helps us to get vaccinating more people.
Okay, we'll tune into that conference. Thank you so much. I think we're going to end. I'm just really so glad that we were able to do an event on the vaccine, especially that our last COVID event was back in May, and that was when we really didn't know that much yet, and it was more about let's learn about the virus, and now we're actually vaccinating people. So how amazing is that? If you're interested in our other events, we have a coffee hour coming up in March 10th. It's going to be devoted to AI and some AI companies popping up here and there. So that's a really hot topic right now. And more information will be sent soon. And once again, the recording of this event will be available on our website and on YouTube. So if you know anybody who could benefit from learning about all this information today, or if you would like to rewatch it, because honestly, I think I will rewatch it, because then you can talk to people as if you really know what you're talking about, as someone in the comments actually indicated that. So thank you once again so much. Thank you to all of our state legislators, Senator Sanborn and Representative Berry, and then all the other honorable legislators who showed up today. I wish you all a wonderful weekend. And if you are not if you're not opposing the vaccination, I wish and I hope that you get your vaccine soon. Okay, see you next time. Thank you so much. Bye, everybody.